Major breaking news. The deep state is on the run as Donald Trump, President of the United States, has just won a huge victory in the United States Court of Appeals for the D.C. Circuit. This is the deep state court of choice by deep staters everywhere, and yet the deep state has just suffered a terrible blow in this case of Wilcox and Harris, allowing President Trump to fire a whole bunch of appointees by those appointed by Democratic picks such as Barack Obama and Joe Biden. It's gone for the deep state as the trend remains our friend. Let's break it all down in this big win for President Trump in the most important deep state court in America, the U.S. Court of Appeals for the D.C. Circuit. Hey folks, I'm Mark Smith, host of the Four Boxes Diner, proud American gun owner, constitutional attorney. Member of the United States Supreme Court Bar, and I'm proud to say the top voice of the Second Amendment in America. Thank you, 2025 Gundies Awards. And of course, as you know, I've been renominated to defend my crown, if you will, for the 2026 Gundies Awards for the top voice of the Second Amendment, the top voices of the 2A. If you feel inclined to vote for the Gundies, I encourage you to vote. Go over to thegundies.com, and vote for Mark Smith, Four Boxes Diner, in the top voices of the 2A. Stiff competition over there, but I got my fingers crossed and the candles lit that we can pull off a repeat with your help, the fans and the friends of the Four Boxes Diner. All right, folks, so huge news today. This is a devastating blow. I cannot emphasize what a big blow this is to America's deep state, which, as you know, is the unelected bureaucrats, almost all of whom are left-wing progressive supporters who want bigger government and less freedom for Americans. The deep state has been a source of power for the Democrats and the progressives and the anti-Americans for many decades. President Trump and Attorney General Pam Bondi and others, including John Sauer, the Solicitor General, are trying to fight back against these people, and they are winning in many cases, slowly but surely. It's a big war, my friends. And as we've talked about before we get to this huge win today, there are many ways in the Second Amendment community, my friends, that we must win. There's different battles we must win to protect our Second Amendment rights. Yes, we must get the Second Amendment jurisprudence correct. We must make sure that lower courts are applying the Bruin-Heller methodology correctly. And we must ensure that the U.S. Supreme Court is taking critical Second Amendment cases to rule in our favor to protect our right to keep and bear arms. But the enemies are everywhere. They are ubiquitous, and we must win other huge battles in addition to the pure doctrine and methodology of Second Amendment jurisprudence. And one huge area of danger is the deep state, to cut back on the power of the deep state. And never confuse the notion of power with legal authority. A kidnapper may have power over a victim, but he doesn't have the legal authority over the victim. The deep state in America, the unelected bureaucrats, have been exercising powers to which they are not entitled for many decades. And part of what the Attorney General is doing, Pam Bondi, Donald Trump, his team, John Sauer, the Solicitor General, is fighting to cut back on the power of the deep state and give it back to we, the people, and our elected officials. And the way this game has gotten played, and now we're going to get to this big win today. The heart of the deep state is the swamp of Washington, D.C. You know that. I know that. That is where the deep state head is. That is where all the power is for the deep state, for the enemy, if you will, the political enemies. And one of the ways they've been able to exercise power over we, the people, and frankly, President Trump and Republican officials, is they get appointed. Members of the deep state, these unelected bureaucracies, get appointed by Democrat presidents like Barack Obama and Joe Biden. And their statutes that they claim prevent the new Republican president, in this case Donald Trump, from firing them. And what is the consequence of that in the real world, my friends? The consequence of that is you have the President of the United States in charge of the executive powers under Article 2 of the Constitution. And yet within the executive branch, which is supposed to be rowing the boat in the direction of the agenda of the president who won a nationwide election, instead you have these deep state officials appointed by Democratic presidents, Biden and Obama, that are rowing against the agenda elected when we, the people, elected President Trump, for example. So President Trump and prior Republican presidents have tried to fire and get rid of these deep staters, these appointed officials by Democrats that were burrowed in and really undercutting the president's powers and agenda items. And the claim was that Congress said the president could not fire these people without good cause, meaning they committed fraud or were convicted of a crime or something. Well, I'm happy to report that is changing slowly but surely and may change hugely in the Supreme Court term this year, but we'll get to Humphrey's executor in just a moment. So Donald Trump has been firing left and right all these deep state appointees by the Democratic Party. And that is exactly what happened in this case involving Kathy Harris and also Gwen Wilcox. Gwen Wilcox and Kathy Harris were respectively appointed by Democratic presidents, as I recall. One to the National Labor Relations Board, the NLRB, and one to the Merit Systems Protection Board. These are multi-member boards where you're appointed for 5 or 7 years or whatever it is for multiple years. You're appointed to this board, and it says under the statute that creates this board that the President of the United States cannot fire your butt without good cause, without a good reason, like you committed fraud or you've engaged in negligence or something terrible like that. So Donald Trump came in here and started firing all these deep state actors that had been appointed by Joe Biden and Barack Obama. Fire them. Get out of here. Goodbye. And they have sued in court saying that the statute that created their jobs, if you will, prevents the president from firing their dupas. President Trump's argument is that I am in charge of Article 2 of the Constitution because I am the president. And the Article 2 says, as the president, I am in charge of the executive branch. And it is wrong to put political partisans that are against my agenda that I was elected to deploy and effectuate in the executive branch and let them wield powers that undercut what I'm trying to accomplish, which is what's been going on to Republican presidents for decades. And I'm happy to report in this case of Wilcox and Harris against President Trump in a 2-1 decision, the United States Court of Appeals for the D.C. Circuit, the heart of the deep state, has just ruled for President Trump that indeed he has the power under Article 2 of the Constitution to fire these individuals who are burrowed into the deep state and trying to undercut his agenda in the view of President Trump. And remember, we've talked about this before, to make you the smartest person in the room. And I think you're going to find what Judge Greg Katsas, who wrote this majority opinion for the D.C. Circuit, has to say is going to ring very familiar with things that you've learned about in detail on this Four Boxes Diner channel. So if you want to know why you tune into this channel to be the smartest person in the room, you'll find out that D.C. Court of Appeals Judge Greg Katsas, a feeder judge to the U.S. Supreme Court when it comes to clerks, by the way, is writing things that you've learned right here and right now at the Four Boxes Diner about why the President of the United States, in charge of Article 2 of the Constitution, gets to fire these individuals and clean out the deep state, which is mission critical to protect our right to keep and bear arms, because whether it's the EPA trying to regulate hunting grounds, whether it's the EPA trying to stop gun ranges in so-called environmental concerns, whether it's the ATF running rogue, whatever it is, the deep state actors, unaccountable to elected officials, are the adversaries most of the time when it comes to protecting our right to keep and bear arms. So if you cut back on their powers, you have essentially expanded our freedoms under the Second Amendment. So again, reminder, there's many ways we have to win. There are many battles outside of the Second Amendment we have to win, and we must never forget that. And this is one such win to cut back on the deep state, which remains enemies, in my opinion, of our right to keep and bear arms. So with that said, here's what Judge Katsas had to say discussing Article 2 under the Constitution and the President's powers, something you all know about from the Four Boxes Diner channel. Check out what Greg Katsas, Judge, D.C. Circuit, has to say here. Article 2 of the Constitution vests the executive power of the United States in a president and requires him to take care that the laws be faithfully executed. In Myers v. United States, the U.S. Supreme Court held that the vesting and take care clauses prevent Congress from restricting the president's ability to remove government officials, i.e. government officers, who wield significant executive power on his behalf. Now, Judge Katsas then points out in this majority opinion for President Trump that there is this other case out there, Humphrey's Executor, that we've talked about before. It's from the FDR era. Franklin Delano Roosevelt, one of the worst presidents ever, as far as I'm concerned. He also brought us the NFA. That was Franklin Delano Roosevelt. And it was Franklin Delano Roosevelt's, Supreme Court, if you will, that blessed this notion of Humphrey's Executor that created the deep state. Because remember, it's Franklin Delano Roosevelt as president that basically creates the deep state, these administrative agencies beholden to nobody except themselves because they are quote-unquote subject matter experts, which we now know is mostly BS. So with that said, Judge Katsas here in this case of Wilcox and Harris against President Trump discusses the creation of the deep state thanks to the Supreme Court precedent from the 1930s, FDR, the case of Humphrey's Executor. Check it out. A different line of precedent qualifies these cases. In Humphrey's Executor, the Supreme Court upheld the constitutionality of a statute barring the President of the United States from removing members of the Federal Trade Commission absent inefficiency, neglect of duty, or malfeasance in office. The Supreme Court acknowledged the holding of Myers that Congress cannot restrict the President's ability to remove purely executive officers, but it concluded that Myers does not govern the removal of an officer who exercises no part of the executive power vested by the Constitution in the President, and it characterized the FTC's powers here not as executive, but as quasi-legislative or quasi-judicial. So did you see the move that Judge Katsas just made there? First of all, he points out that Article 2 creates the President of the United States in the executive branch, and it's the job of the president to faithfully execute on those federal laws. As a side note, to get geeky here, this is one of sort of the tensions involving the enforcement of the NFA, by the way, because there is an argument historically as a matter of institutionalism that the President of the United States is supposed to enforce existing federal laws. We've talked about exceptions to that, but again, that take care clause found in Article 2 of the Constitution does indicate that in some ways the president has a duty to defend laws enacted by Congress. But again, as we've discussed in other cases, there are exceptions to that. And of course, that's how we get into sort of my discussions at the NFA, which we don't need to belabor the point in this particular video. Now, with that said, Judge Katsas in this decision of Harris and Wilcox versus President Trump goes on to talk exactly about what I've taught you here, the three branches of government. And again, these unelected bureaucrats, these deep state officials don't fall into any of the three branches of government. They're essentially a fourth branch of government, an independent branch of government, and that is verboten under the Constitution itself. And here's what Judge Katsas has to say, and it's going to ring very familiar to you guys who follow the Four Boxes Diner. Check it out. The United States Supreme Court increasingly has stressed that there are only three kinds of constitutional powers, and two of them are non-delegable, I mean you can't delegate them. The court says, our Constitution divided the powers of the new federal government into three defined categories: legislative, executive, and judicial. Only Congress itself may exercise the legislative power, and only life-tenured judges may exercise the judicial power of the United States. So by the process of elimination, if agencies may receive neither legislative nor judicial powers, what is left of them other than some portion of the executive power? Exactly right. Exactly as we've discussed with the deep state and why it's in many aspects unconstitutional to the extent they try to create a separation between themselves and the president. Article 1 of the Constitution creates the legislative branch of the Congress to pass the laws. Article 2 creates the president to enforce the laws. That's Article 2 of the Constitution. And Article 3 creates the Supreme Court and federal courts. These deep state actors, these supposed independent actors, want to be separate from the three branches of government. They want to be a fourth branch of government where they cannot be fired by the President of the United States, and yet they don't work for the president. At least they don't advance his agenda in his view. They don't work for Congress, and they don't work for the judges. They don't work for the courts. So they're independent fourth branch of government, which is clearly unconstitutional. And that's why right here and right now, in this case of Harris and Wilcox versus Donald J. Trump, involving these multi-member boards of these agencies, Judge Katsas in this 2-1 decision just knocked out and said, yes, Donald Trump can fire these individuals because they are functioning as officers of the executive branch, and President Trump runs the executive branch. And just like the CEO of a company can fire people that he views as not doing what needs to be done to advance the interest of the company, let's say, so too as the CEO, the president of the federal government under Article 2 of the Constitution, that's his term, a president, gets to run the executive branch. If he thinks there's people in the executive branch that are trying to slow down the agenda or work against the agenda, he can fire their dupa. And that is essentially what this decision says here today in the U.S. Court of Appeals for the D.C. Circuit. And I want to stress that this is not some random court in West Texas. This is literally the appellate court that lives and breathes the swamp in D.C., ruling in favor of President Trump, ruling in favor of the Constitution, and knocking out the powers, the authority of the deep state to run amok without any accountability from we the people and our elected representatives. All right, with that said, here is the critical language from this opinion, knocking out major parts of the deep state just now. These appeals present the question whether Congress may constitutionally prohibit the president from removing members of the National Labor Relations Board and the Merit Systems Protection Board without cause. The district courts upheld the constitutionality of statutory removal protections for members of these boards. We, however, reverse. Under Humphrey's Executive versus the United States, Congress may restrict the president's ability to remove principal officers who wield only quasi-legislative or quasi-judicial powers. But now, under existing law, Congress may not restrict the president's ability to remove principal officers who wield substantial executive power. As explained below, the NLRB and the MSPB wield substantial powers that are both executive in nature and different from the powers that Humphrey's executor deemed to be merely quasi-legislative or quasi-judicial. So Congress cannot constitutionally restrict the president's ability to remove NLRB or MSPB members, period. All right, folks, so a big win for President Trump and the freedom-loving Americans over the deep state today. We have more wins to come, I suspect. It's a long, long fight we have ahead of us, but the trend is our friend. So I hope you enjoyed today's episode, and I hope you're following me over there on X at @4boxdiner. Don't forget to subscribe both to YouTube and to Rumble. Don't forget to vote for the top voices of the 2A over there at thegundies.com for the 4 Boxes Diner. And I look forward to talking to all of you again real soon here at the 4 Boxes Diner.
Orders up. Table 2A.